Alright, so we've spent some time getting to know the story and defining the purpose for the dashboard. So now it's time to get our hands dirty. And let's start with the first pivot table showing seasonality. Now this heat map is actually doing a decent job here, but since we're the data-viz specialists, let's see if we can tell this story a little bit better. And by this point, if you haven't already, feel free to really give this project your own spin and create a dashboard that you feel best communicates the story and drives the final recommendation. And if at any time you feel like you're getting stuck, then you can just continue to follow along with me. Now, in this project, we are going to be visualizing data from pivot tables, which we haven't done yet. So what we need to do is with any cell selected, go to Insert a Pivot Chart. And what this is a chart that is dynamically tied to the data in our pivot table. So everything that's in the pivot table must be in the chart, and everything that's in the chart must be in the pivot table. And this limitation is precisely the reason that I usually don't like to build pivot table based dashboards and like to use formula based dashboards instead, since they do offer a much higher degree of flexibility. But for now, let's go back to our pivot chart. And since we are trying to visualize two metrics on completely different scales, we are going to need a combo chart. But the big question is, what chart do we use for each metric? Well, since we're showing comparison across time, we could just do a line for both, and then just add a secondary axis, which does show the seasonal pattern, to be honest, so you can feel free to go with that option. I'm just not a big fan of showing two lines that represent different metrics. So I'm going to plot the average daily rate on a column chart instead. So let's select that. We can still see the seasonal patterns here. Press OK. And you'll see that we're getting these gray buttons on our chart, adding all this clutter. Those are actually field buttons that are tied to the pivot chart. But in the Pivot Chart Analyze menu, we can simply click on this and get rid of those. And to deal with all this white space here, I'm going to select my legend, format it, and let's place it at the top instead. And let's get rid of our chart border, format, and no outline. I'm going to move my chart down here just so we have a little bit more space to work with. So let's continue to take care of the usual suspects and select the columns. Go to Format the Data Series and change the gap width to 85%. And you know what? Let's be a bit proactive this time and think about the color as we build this, because we do already know what the story is going to be like. So I'm looking at the orange and the blue here, and between the two, I'd say that orange is more appropriate for showing the cancellation rates, since these are negative for the business. So I'm going to switch these around. Let's select a line, go to the fill options, and change this to an orange. I'm going to make it a bit thicker as well, and let's make it a smooth line. And then for our columns, let's switch these to blue. And now that I see it, it is a little bit striking, so I'm going to mute the blue down a little bit. Whoops. Alright, that's better. Now, looking at my x-axis, I'm not a huge fan of the text being aligned vertically this way. So let's see if I make this wider, if that will fix it. Looks like it did. And now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the grid lines here. Now, I know that I usually remove them, but I do want to show you a way that we can make them work here. Now, the tricky part when working with a secondary y-axis is that the grid lines only align with the primary axis. So you'll see that these make sense here, but when you come over here, then these numbers don't really align with anything. Now, Excel does let us go to Design, Grid Lines, and add a secondary axis, but that's just a recipe for disaster, so let's avoid that. And what we can actually do is try to find a way to have the same number of intervals on both sides, and that way the same grid line will align with both. So this goes from 0 to 250 in 5 intervals of 50, and this goes from 0 to 45% in 9 intervals of 5. So if we switch this to 5 intervals of 9 instead, switch this from a 5 to a 9, you'll see that now the grid lines align with the numbers on both sides. The problem, as you may have noticed, is that using intervals of 9% is kind of confusing. So let's undo that and let's see if we can find a solution here. Now, as I'm looking at this, technically this y-axis doesn't need to go up to 45% because the highest value is actually just 39%. So if we change the max here to 40% instead, now we just have 8 intervals, which is a much easier number to work with. So if we go to this axis now, what's the next number down from 250 that we can divide by 8? Well, 240, right? So let's change this from 250 to 240, and let's do 8 intervals as well of 30, which is a nice round number. And what do you know? It looks like the grid lines might be of some use here. Now, I will agree that they still add a little bit of noise, but what we can do is select them, and in the format options, let's select the light gray and change it from a straight line into this pointed line here. Select that, and now you'll see that the grid lines neatly fade into the background. So we've got a decent looking combo chart here that, most importantly, does a great job in showing that both of these series follow the same seasonal trends. But if we really want to be proactive and drive this point home, let's add markers and data labels for the repeating peaks and valleys here. So I'm going to start with the low values here, select this point, go to marker, and add a built-in marker. Again, you know that I like size 7 with a white fill. You know what? Let's change it up this time. I'm going to do size 8, and since these are low cancellation rates, it means they're good, right? So I'm going to do a green fill and a white border. Make the border thicker. Let's see how that looks. I'd say that's pretty decent. So let's go back. Let me just check these settings that I applied here. Alright, and now let's just add a data label. Select that, apply it below, and make it bold and a bit bigger. And now I'm just going to go through and do the same for these. So let's add marker here. And this time I'm going to place this one at the top, so above. And now let's keep going. And we're done. Now that did take me quite a bit because I had to add each one manually. Now if we weren't working with a pivot table, we could have added 2 new series, one for peaks and one for valleys. But it doesn't matter because this is a one-time thing, and now it's really clear that the cancellation rates and the average daily prices follow the same trend, which is to max out in the summer and then cool off by January.